20 doesn't give you any break.
They don't distinguish between capital and ordinary income. Sure. So the other aspect of this is there was a rule adopted recently, and Congress likes to talk about how are you going to pay for this. You know, they adopt this very generous welfare program or social program and so forth, and the more conservative members of Congress might say, well, how are we going to pay for this? Because we have to raise enough taxes to pay for these social programs or what have you. And so one of the things that they put in was an adjustment to this exclusion rule having to do with so-called non-qualifying use. I'm not going to begin to pretend to quote this book and verse today.
Right.
All I know is that after 2008, for use after 2008, if the property falls outside of the ordinary use as a principal residence, then it can become non-qualifying, which modifies the formula. The formula is for a single taxpayer, they might get up to $250,000 exclusion. For a married couple filing jointly, they might get up to $500,000 exclusion. But those numbers are reduced based on a complicated formula contained in the statute.
Okay. It's a mess, folks. Okay, and you've already talked about accumulated depreciation, so we're going to move on. And so this is another area, though, that is a concern for a lot of people. What if something happens and I don't make the 2 years, so I have to get out of the home for some reason? This is a big thing these days, of course, with the short sale and foreclosure type of a situation, or people have economic reverses. There's so many people who have been laid off. I mean, that's another thing. So what happens in these types of circumstances?
Well, one thing I want to point out is, and of course this is not going to be a terrible concern today because houses don't go up, they don't jump, the values don't jump like they did 5 or 6 years ago.
Right.
But one of the things about the rule when adopted in '97 was that you could only use it once every 2 fiscal years. So if you used it today, you'd have to wait 2 years from today before you used it again.
Right. And
there were special rules about if you used it more than one, you could sort of pick the best one and that kind of thing. But that's really not happening now. Mm-hmm. The other thing that was happening was, let's say I bought a house today and I paid $100 for it and it went up to $150 within a year's time, and then all of a sudden my wife got really sick and we couldn't afford it because she had a job and the second income paid for the mortgage or the property taxes or what have you. So we have to sell the house, and I've got this gain of 50. Right. Which is a meaningful gain, but I haven't reached my 2 years. So what's the relief? Well, the statute provides exceptions for the 2-year requirement. The exception, there's three types of exceptions. If you have to sell the property for a health reason, or for a job change reason, or for specific reasons that are specified by the regs, unforeseen circumstances that are beyond the taxpayer's control, which are basically hardship types of things. If you sell during when you have not reached the 2-year mark on the ownership or the occupancy, and you have a gain, you can use part of the gain. So if I've had the ownership and occupancy for 1 year, and I ordinarily would have a $500,000 exclusion, I would get half of that. I get $250, or I get $125 for a single person.
Right. So that's a big help. And
it can be a big help. Of course, it was a big deal a few years ago when people were flipping houses like corn dogs, you know.
Right. Well, anyway, but one of the things that's interesting about this is that actually the IRS has been fairly liberal.
Correct.
In its rulings on this.
Well, they talk about multiple births or people having to move neighborhoods because a child got assaulted on the way home from school, so making that neighborhood not desirable, and it just wasn't tenable to live there. And so the IRS has said, well, that seems to be a reasonable hardship, yes.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's the good news. But the problems on many of these is that they're private rulings that only apply supposedly to the person who applied for them.
Correct.
And so you may need to apply for your own.
Well, here's an interesting thing about this. When we first got the law in '97, the law is very clear. It's the unforeseen circumstances specified in the regs.
Right.
And what was happening, especially the taxpayers would call the non-professionals. They would call and they would say, "Well, gee, that's a hardship," and that they'd come up with something that sounded legitimate, but it really wasn't specified in the regs, which was a statutory requirement. And so we've had to sort of wait through all these years and see how the IRS feels, how the wind is blowing.
Yeah.
So that's something where somebody has a circumstance like that, they need to get with the professional who understands these rules can evaluate them.
Right. Okay. Are there any special considerations when you bought your principal residence before August 6th, 1997? Ooh, boy, that's pretty specific. There must be something.
Well, one of the reasons they put the rule in was because before the rule, we had this burden to lug around all the paperwork. And I had these cases back in the 80s and the early 90s where Grandma would buy the property in 1942, then she would move in 1949, and then she'd move again in 1958, and then she'd move again in 64. And every time we had one of these transactions, the gain from the property was in effect transferred to the next property. And
right.
so what you might have bought your last house in '86 for $200,000, but the base price for computing a future sale, a gain on a future sale, was really based on the transactions dating all the way back to 1952 or something.
Yeah, so you had to subtract all of those gains that you didn't take before.
Correct.
From what you paid for the property in order to figure out.
Correct, and there used to be a form, and you had to file this Form 2119 and so forth. And so for the property that was held before that time, you might have said, okay, well, in '86 we paid $200,000 for it, but that really wasn't the whole story. And so as an advisor, or even as a taxpayer doing their own return, you have to sort of quiz yourself, okay, what happened here, and it sort of compounded this issue. So as time goes by, this problem is getting less and less. As we've discussed, the basis changes. Basis can step up or could have stepped up if a spouse passes away. That kind of thing, yes.
Yeah, but you really have to go back and look at the history on these properties to try to figure out what
unfortunately, the rule is sort of transitioned in the record keeping. The idea in the long run is to keep the record keeping simple.
Yeah.
What did we pay for this property only?
Yeah.
But for those people that had properties, the basis of which was reflected back to an older transaction, well, they've still got to maintain those records, because if they don't and they have a transaction, they could get audited, and then they wouldn't be able to defend their claim.
Right. Okay. What's a residence?
Well, a residence is a dwelling unit, and it can be a boat. If it has a toilet and a kitchen, that's sort of the base thing. It could be a boat. I guess it could be a tent, although that's probably not real estate. It could be a dwelling house. It could be a condo, which is typically just airspace. That's legally, you don't own the walls or the ceiling. You just own the airspace. So it's basically a dwelling unit for human occupancy with a toilet and a kitchen. It's sort of the basic.
So it could be like a yacht, or it could be a motor coach.
Correct. It could be a motor coach. That's
any
correct.
of these things. So
right.
Anyway, it's pretty broad, and for most of these things, these rules don't make that much difference anyway, because a lot of those is depreciate. They don't increase in value. But,
correct, yeah.
But anyway, it's just interesting to know. All right. Well, these days we are seeing people that have these short sales and foreclosures. Can this exclusion actually apply for some of the people that are going through these